So the symposium today is on a couple of the essays from Father Ramillow's edited anthology. Here it is, to give you another look at it, and I'll hold it up every now and again, shamelessly to plug it, available at Amazon. So go take a look at that after the event today. I'd like to thank Father Ramillow for editing a fine anthology, and both Father Ramillow and Father Dodds for the invitation to comment on it here and on their essays. Though there's a great deal of interesting material in the book and much that could be said about it, given time constraints, I'm going to confine myself to commenting on Father Ramillow's essay on God and miracles and Father Dodd's essay on God and the nature of life. And though no doubt most of the people here haven't read the essays, what I have to say will be fairly self-contained, so that won't be a problem. So these are remarks inspired by what Fathers Ramillow and Dodds have to say in their essays in the book. I found both papers to be very rich and thought-provoking, and I hope that what I have to say will also provoke thought. I also expect and hope that it will not be too provocative, since I'm essentially in agreement with both papers. Still, I suppose I would not be a Thomist if I did not have quibbles about this or that way of putting things, or did not prefer to emphasize particular aspects of an issue or to suggest further areas for exploration. So while what follows is for the most part along the lines of sympathetic supplementation, there is also a little constructive criticism. And I realize, of course, that my own remarks might invite a lot of constructive criticism from Fathers Ramillow and Dodds and from the audience members. So let me comment first on Father Ramillow's paper, The God of Miracles, which is here in this anthology, now available on Amazon, in case I didn't mention that. I expect my cut from the proceeds. I want to address three sets of issues raised by Father Ramillow's paper. First, what is a miracle? Second, why is the evidence for miracles not more overwhelming than it is? And why are miracles not more common? These are, of course, distinct questions, but I want to discuss them together because the answers might, I think, be closely intertwined. Third, can an appeal to miracles form the basis for an independent argument for the existence of God, or do we need first to know that God exists in order to establish the occurrence of a miracle? So let's take these questions in order, starting with the question of what a miracle is. Since the time of David Hume, Scottish philosopher, empiricist philosopher David Hume, a miracle has often been characterized as a violation of a law of be followed by B would constitute a miracle. So to oversimplify considerably on this David Hume conception of a law, it's something essentially of the form whenever A, then B. Whenever A, then B. So to take a David Hume style example, whenever you take an object of the size of an ordinary size and shape and solidity of an ordinary billiard ball and knock it into another one, it will cause the second one to move, so forth, that kind of thing. Or you throw a stone toward a window about the thickness of those windows, it will be followed by the window breaking, or what have you. Okay, so since Hume's time, the idea of what a law of nature has essentially been that, a statement of form, something like that. And a law-like correlation, then, between A and B, whenever A, B. Now, this conception of what laws of nature are underlies skeptical arguments to the effect that the notion of a miracle is incoherent, insofar as evidence that some purported violation of a law occurred would really just be evidence that the purported law in question wasn't really a law in the first place, so that there was no true violation and thus no miracle. This isn't exactly David Hume's argument, but it's an argument that is sometimes inspired by Hume's understanding of what a miracle is. A miracle is a violation of a law of nature, and a law of nature is something of that form. Whenever A occurs, then B occurs. So the idea is, well, the violation of a law of nature, that really makes no sense, because if it's really a law of nature, then whenever A occurs, B occurs. That's a law-like connection. You can't have one without the other. So if you actually have a case where A occurs without B following, that's not a miracle, because it's not a violation of a law of nature in the first place, because if you had a case where A occurred without B, then that statement wasn't a law in the first place. That's one criticism often made. of miracles, and it's one that Father Ramelow discusses in the essay. Now, from the point of view of the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysician, this characterization of miracles is problematic for reasons indicated by Father Ramelow in his essay. On the standard Aristotelian account, a law of nature is a description of the tendencies or dispositions that a thing will exhibit given its nature or essence. For example, if it is a law of nature that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then what this involves is just water's having, by virtue of its essence or nature, a tendency or disposition to freeze at that temperature. As it happens, this example is oversimplified, since liquid water can, in unusual circumstances, exist at cooler temperatures. But that only reinforces the point that when we talk about laws, we are really talking about tendencies or dispositions, and a tendency or disposition can be blocked or manifest only when certain conditions obtain. As Father Ramelow writes, quote, "Laws of nature are really about the dispositional properties of things, based on the kinds of things they are. Things of kind A have a disposition to manifest quality F in condition C in virtue of being of nature N. For Aquinas, laws of nature are not strictly universal generalizations, but descriptive of what happens normally, in other words, according to the nature of things. Exceptions are quite compatible with such laws," unquote. So one problem with characterizations of miracles as violations of laws of nature, at least from the point of view of a Thomist, a follower of Aquinas, is that these characterizations often reflect too crude an understanding of how laws work. If a law describes a thing's natural dispositions, and a disposition can really be present and yet still fail to manifest, either if the manifestation is blocked or if the triggering conditions are not present, then such a failure to manifest will not as such constitute a violation of the law. Hence, it will not as such count either as evidence of a miracle or, for that matter, as evidence that the purported law was not, after all, a true law. There's another problem with characterizing miracles as violations of laws of nature. As David Oderberg sums up the Aristotelian Thomistic view of laws in his book Real Essentialism, quote, "The laws of nature are the laws of natures. For natures, as in the nature of a thing, natures are just abstract essences in concrete operation. Nature, as in the natural world, the natural order of things, is the collection of all the natures of things. So to say the laws are of nature is to say they are of the natures of things." Laws of nature, in other words, to talk about laws of nature is a shorthand for talking about the way a thing will operate given its nature, the way water operates given the nature of water, the way stone operates or fire operates given the nature of water and stone, respectively. Now, an implication of this conception of laws emphasized by Oderberg is that the laws of nature are not, as Hume and his followers suppose, contingent. The Humean view is that something could be just the thing that it is, water or fire or an acorn or a dog, while governed by different laws and thus entering into entirely different causal relations. Hence, if you buy David Hume's view, water might, in theory, turn into chocolate mousse at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire might cause water to freeze rather than to boil. An acorn might grow into a dog. A dog might be able to fly by wagging its tail, and so forth, if only the laws of nature were different. You could have the very same entities governed by different laws, and they would exhibit very different behaviors as a result. But from an Aristotelian point of view, from Aquinas' point of view, this makes no sense. Since laws of nature are the laws of the natures of things, if the laws were different, the natures would be different, and thus the things would be different. Anything that reliably turned to chocolate mousse at 32 degrees Fahrenheit just wouldn't be water in the first place. Anything that reliably grew into a dog just wouldn't be an acorn, and so on. Since laws of nature reflect the natures or essences of things, they are metaphysically necessary. They could not have been otherwise. To be sure, there could have been a world without water, fire, acorns, or dogs in it in the first place. That's a possibility. But which did have entities which in certain superficial ways resembled these things, maybe looked like them or what have you. In that sense, the laws of nature that actually obtain need not have obtained. But what there could not have been is a world which really had water. It was really water, really had fire, acorns, and dogs in it, but where these things did not naturally behave in the ways in fact they do behave. Now, if laws of nature are metaphysically necessary, they could not have been otherwise, then violations of the laws are impossible. Of course, the manifestation of a disposition might still either be blocked or lack the requisite triggers, but if the triggers are present and no blocks are present, the triggering mechanism is there. Say you've got the presence of oxygen when you strike a match and the match has not been submerged in water, everything's in good working order, and there's nothing blocking the manifestation, namely fire, then the manifestation will follow necessarily. But then what is a miracle if not a violation of the laws of nature? And how could miracles occur if laws are, as I say, metaphysically necessary on the Aristotelian and Thomistic view? Father Ramelow suggests the following answer in his essay, quote, "What defines a miracle is not merely that it is an exception to what is natural, which would be true for defects as well, but that it elevates the nature of a thing to a power that cannot be accounted for by this nature. Unlike said defects, miracles are exceptions that are supernatural rather than subnatural. As such, miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. Even though they would have to be called physically impossible, yet they are not contrary to nature. Rather, they are beyond nature in the sense of elevating it to a higher power," unquote. As Father Ramelow goes on to note, qua supernatural, miracles can only have a divine cause and must not be confused with the extraordinary but still merely preternatural effects that an angel might produce. Finite spirits are still part of the natural order of things, as Thomists understand the natural order. Now, all of this seems to me not only correct but extremely important. Properly understood, miracles are in no way comparable to magic nor to a kind of advanced technology. For God is not merely an especially powerful cause alongside other natural and preternatural causes. Rather, he is altogether outside the order of natural and preternatural causes as the metaphysical precondition of there being any causal power at all. You might say that he does not merely have causal power, but that he just is causal power itself, just as he is goodness itself and being itself, subsistent being itself. Just as he does not merely participate in being or goodness, but is rather precisely that in which those things which have goodness and being participate. He's the standard of being and goodness rather than just merely one instance among others of being and goodness. So too is he that in which things which have causal power participate. He's not merely one cause among others, but he's the source of all causal power. That is the manner in which he is the first cause. First in the sense of primary or fundamental. First in the sense of that from which all other merely secondary causes derive their causal power. Hence, it would be a sheer mistake to think that the difference between ordinary events and miracles is that whereas the former happen on their own, God causes the latter. The world is not like an airplane on autopilot with God interfering from time to time to perform a course correction. The Thomist utterly rejects this essentially deistic conception of God. God is the ultimate cause of all things, the natural and preternatural as well as the miraculous. Indeed, it is the ordinary course of things and not miracles, which is for a classical theist like Aquinas the most direct evidence of God's existence and action as first cause. As Father Brian Davis writes, quote, "Some people would say that God can intervene so as to bring it about that changes occur in the world. On the classical theist account, however, such changes cannot be literally thought of as divine interventions, since they and what preceded them are equally the creative work of God," unquote. Davis goes on to quote Herbert McCabe, who says, quote, "It is clear that God cannot interfere in the universe, not because he has not the power, but because, so to speak, he has too much. To interfere, you have to be an alternative to or alongside what you are interfering with. If God is the cause of everything, there is nothing that he is alongside," unquote. And Davis adds, quote, "You cannot intervene in what you are doing yourself. And, say classical theists, God cannot literally intervene in his own created order," unquote. Like the term violation, the term intervention wrongly suggests that a miracle is a kind of violent motion, as if God has to force things to go in a certain direction. That would be a fitting characterization if the world were a machine and God a machinist who occasionally steps in to fine-tune it. But it is highly misleading given a classical theist conception of God and his relationship to the world. A better analogy might be to think of the world as music and God as the musician who is playing the music. Divine conservation of the ordinary natural course of things is comparable to the musician's playing the music according to the written score as he has it before his mind. God's causing a miracle is comparable to the musician temporarily departing from that score, as in the sort of improvisation characteristic of jazz. The musician hardly has to force the music to go in some way it wasn't already going. Every note, including the written ones that precede and follow the improvised ones, is produced by the musician. Still, the improvisation definitely adds to the score something that wasn't already there, just as in Father Ramelow's words, a miracle goes, quote, beyond nature and elevates it to a higher power. Classical theists have long had a fondness for Bach, but perhaps they should switch to John Coltrane or Thelonious Monk. Or we might think of the world, to change analogies here, as a movie and God as the director. The natural order of things, considered just by itself, is like the movie in the version originally released to the theaters. The natural order of things, together with miracles, is like the director's cut of the movie, later released on DVD. I don't know what St. Thomas would think of these analogies, but I'm going to run with them. Both versions are the work of the director, just like the natural order and miracles are both the work of God. But the director's cut includes new material, perhaps even subplots and other scenes that dramatically alter the film, just as miracles dramatically alter the natural order of things. Or to suggest one more analogy, the world might be compared to a story and God to the author of the story. The ordinary natural course of things is like the story as it originally appeared, and miracles are like additions to the story made when it is republished in a second edition. If you'll forgive my adding a science fiction example to my jazz example, we might say that the natural order is like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series as it originally appeared serially in Astounding magazine, and the natural order together with miracles is like the series as it appeared in the later book version, with new material added to the existing stories and followed up by various sequels and prequels, which provide further context that dramatically alters the way we perceive the events that occurred in the original stories. And if you don't like that example, just plug in your favorite, I don't know, Downton Abbey or anything to which later material is added in the box set or something. Now, in all of these examples, a musical score is originally written, a movie in its original theatrical release version, a story as originally published. We have artistic productions that are complete and perfect as far as they go. Just as adding an improvisation or a new scene or a new chapter is not necessarily a matter of correcting a defect in a piece of music, a film, or a novel, neither is a miracle essentially a matter of correcting some defect in nature. It is rather a matter of taking something that is already good and complete as far as it goes and raising it to an even higher level, just as a jazz improvisation or a director's cut or a second edition of a book might take something that was already good and complete and make it even better. Again, this dovetails with Father Ramelow's description of a miracle as something that is, quote, not contrary to nature, but rather beyond nature, in the sense of elevating it to a higher power, unquote. Having said that, it does seem to me that, in light of my proposed analogies, one of Father Ramelow's own analogies is perhaps not entirely apt. At one point in his essay, he writes, quote, thus, encountering the miracle of the resurrection is like finding the lost chapter of a novel that finally makes the plot meaningful, giving it unexpected significance and thereby showing itself to be part of the novel, unquote. Now, the trouble with this analogy, it seems to me, is that it suggests that nature by itself is imperfect or incomplete, and that a miracle is the correction of a defect, though in fairness to Father Ramelow, he may not have intended to imply that. If that were the case, then a miracle would not really be beyond nature or elevated to something higher, as Father Ramelow elsewhere says that it does. Rather, it would merely bring nature up to the level it should already have been at from the start, as it were, by adding a missing piece. Nature would not be like a complete score to which an improvisation is added, but like a score which is missing a page. It would not be like the theatrical release of a movie, but rather like a defective print of the original theatrical release, which is missing scenes and is thus incoherent. Or it would not be like the first edition of a book, which is complete as far as it goes, but rather like a defective copy of the book, which is missing pages. Miracles would, in that case, not be supernatural, but would merely remedy certain privations in nature, the absences of things that ought to be there. So it seems to me that the correct thing to say is not that a miracle like the resurrection, quote, finally makes the plot meaningful, unquote, which makes it sound like the plot was otherwise incoherent or unintelligible, but rather while the plot was already meaningful as far as it went, a miracle like the resurrection adds layers of meaning to the original plot that could not otherwise have been discerned. In another respect, too, it seems to me that Father Ramelow's characterization of what a miracle is might be revised or at least supplemented. Whether he is speaking of a miracle as something which is, quote, not contrary to but beyond nature and elevates it, or characterizing it as comparable to a lost chapter, Father Ramelow gives the impression that a miracle is always a matter of God's adding something to nature and never a matter of taking something away. But that does not seem to be correct. To be sure, the final cause of miracles, qua supernatural, is certainly to add something to the natural order. That's ultimately their point. But the means by which a miracle does this need not involve an addition to the natural order of things, but could involve a subtraction. Hence, while the resurrection certainly added something to the natural course of things, as do miracles like the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, a miracle like the one involving Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace seems to involve a mere subtraction from the natural order. It is what does not happen to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that is significant. They are not burnt as they would have been had nature taken its course. There's a kind of subtraction in nature rather than addition. Now, how can this be if, as both Father Ramelow and I emphasize, a miracle is not a violation of a law of nature? And indeed, if, as I have said, such violations are metaphysically impossible, doesn't the failure of the fire to burn Daniel's friends constitute just such a violation? It does not. As Oderberg argues, a miracle is properly construed not as a breach or violation of a law of nature, but rather as a suspension of such a law. He draws an analogy with human positive law. God's bringing about a breach or violation of a law of nature would be comparable to a government leaving a law on the books but refraining from investigating or punishing violations of that law. But a miracle is not like that. A miracle is rather like a government's temporarily revoking a law, taking it off the books so that actions that would otherwise count as violations no longer so count. To put the point in terms of the analogies proposed earlier, we might say that while a miracle like the resurrection is like a musician adding something to the written score in an improvisation, a miracle like Daniel's friend's failure to be burned by the fire is like the musician refraining from playing certain notes that were originally in the score. Or we might say that it is like a director leaving out a key scene from the theatrical release of a movie, or a novelist leaving out a key passage that was originally intended for the book. Keep in mind that for the Thomist, a thing can operate at any instant only insofar as God conserves it in being at that instant and also concurs with its causal activity with it at that instant, imparting to it the causal power by which it acts according to its nature. So, from the Thomistic point of view, nothing can operate at all at any instant unless God not only keeps it existing from moment to moment, as he's keeping me in existence from moment to moment, but also insofar as God concurs with its causal activity. So for me to do anything, including give this talk, I have to not only be maintained in being by God, but he also has to continuously add causal power to what I'm doing so that the result can follow, namely the talk. So if you don't like the talk, don't blame me. So ultimately... Now, the sort of miracle that involves subtracting something from the natural order rather than adding something to it involves not God acting in a special way, but rather his refraining from acting as a conserving and concurring cause, as he normally does. In the case at hand, it is not that God conserves fire in being together with its preconditions, oxygen, etc., and concurs with their causal activity, yet somehow causes this collection of factors to act in a way that is contrary to their nature, so that Daniel's friends are not burned. That would be a violation of the law of a law of nature, but that's not the right way to understand that story. Rather, he refrains from conserving in being and or concurring in the activity of some or all of the factors, so that the normal effect does not follow. That is a suspension rather than a violation of the natural order. It is not a case of God violently interfering with what he has brought about, but rather a case of his not bringing certain things about in the first place. So that is how I would propose supplementing Father Ramelow's account of what a miracle is. In light of what has been said so far, let me now more briefly address the other issues that I raised at the beginning. Why is the evidence for miracles not more overwhelming than it is? And why are miracles not more common? This is the second set of issues I alluded to at the beginning. Father Ramelow suggests an answer to the first question when he writes, quote, "No religion claims miracles more than Christianity. It is better confirmed by its evidence than other religions. Yet neither can and does God make this too manifest, because we would otherwise lose the challenge to believe," unquote. Similarly, he suggests that God does not, quote, "make the evidence too strong," possibly because he does not want to overpower our free response. Now, I think this is a common view of the matter, but it seems to me potentially problematic, though in fairness to Father Ramelow, his remarks are very brief on this subject in the essay, and I want to be careful not to read too much into them. One problem with it is that there are some people, such as eyewitnesses to miracles, whose evidential situation prevents them from seriously doubting that a miracle has really occurred, but their free will hasn't been interfered with. So even Thomas the Apostle, who doubted Christ's resurrection at first, could hardly have continued to doubt when he actually met the risen Christ in the flesh and put his fingers into the holes in Christ's hand, and his hand into his side and so forth. For another thing, since we can know that a divine revelation really has occurred only if it is backed by miracles, we have to be able to know with certainty that the relevant miracles really have occurred. Otherwise, the rational justification of the faith would stand in jeopardy. The First Vatican Council seems to have had just this concern when it declared in very strong language, quote, "If anyone says that miracles can never be known with certainty, nor can the divine origin of the Christian religion be proved from them, let him be anathema," unquote. Now, mind you, I'm not flinging an anathema at Father Ramelow, who I'm sure agrees with this statement of the Council. The point is rather just to emphasize that, while I think he is correct to say that God always leaves room for us freely to respond to him, that freedom must be compatible with a very high degree of certainty about the occurrence of miracles. I would propose that the reason the evidence for miracles is not more overwhelming is simply that miracles are not very common. By their very nature, they cannot be very common. Unlike the phenomena studied in the natural sciences, miracles don't involve regular and repeatable patterns, hypotheses about which may be tested via observation and experiment. Indeed, by their very nature, they involve deviations from regular patterns. Naturally, then, they are not going to be knowable with the kind of certainty we get from well-confirmed theories in the natural sciences or general truths of metaphysics. Now, that just raises the question of why miracles do not occur more frequently. Here I would propose that the reason is precisely so that their supernatural character is not obscured. Suppose miracles were as common as rain. It occurs to me that's not a really good example in California lately. They are as common as rain. As common as air. How about that? Okay. Then the distinction between the miraculous and the natural course of things would be difficult or impossible for us to see. We might conclude that everything is a kind of miracle and adopt an essentially occasionalist view of God's relationship to the world, according to which it's really God who's always doing everything, and natural things don't really have any causal power at all. If miracles happen constantly, there would be no clear distinction between the miraculous and the non-miraculous, and it might seem as if God's the author of absolutely everything. So we might be led to an essentially occasionalist view of God's relationship to the world with all of its theological dangers, such as a tendency toward pantheism. Occasionalism has this problem that if you say it's really God doing everything and nothing else is doing anything, then it's hard to see how the objects in our ordinary experience really have any reality. If they don't do anything, in what sense are they real? Maybe they're really just ideas in the divine mind, say, which you've got kind of an identification of God in the world. Or we might instead conclude from the lack of regularity in the world, if miracles occur all the time, we might go to an opposite extreme conclusion. We might conclude from this lack of regularity in the world, miracles are happening all the time, that there just simply is no rhyme or reason to the world, which might lead us to a kind of Humean skepticism or even atheism. So you need some kind of regularity in order to get something like an argument from the world to God going in the first place. If miracles happen all the time, the regularities in the world would not be evident, and we might be left with some kind of skepticism instead. Either way, that there is a natural order of things would no longer be evident, and as a consequence that there is a supernatural order of things would also no longer be evident, since we understand the supernatural by contrast with the natural. Either everything would seem to be supernatural, or nothing would. A much greater frequency of miracles would, in short, and to borrow a phrase used by Pope Pius XII in a very different context, quote, destroy the gratuity of the supernatural order, unquote. It's from Humani Generis. Thus, to preserve the clarity of the distinction of the natural and the supernatural, God must not cause miracles too frequently, and therefore we must not be surprised that the kind of certainty we can have that they do sometimes occur is not the kind that we can have vis-a-vis scientific findings. It's a result of repeatable phenomena on which we can perform experimental tests and so forth. That's just not in the nature of the case, the sort of thing we could possibly expect of a miracle. Finally, can an appeal to miracles, to turn finally to this last question I raised at the beginning, can an appeal to miracles form the basis for an independent argument for the existence of God, kind of a standalone argument? Or do we need to first to know that God exists in order to establish the occurrence of a miracle? Father Ramelow briefly touches on this issue in his essay, and he seems to leave the matter open. Now, it is of course possible that someone in fact happens to come to believe in the existence of God on the basis of a miracle, especially if it's one that he has witnessed himself. I don't deny that that can occur and that it can be rational. But could a true demonstration of God's existence, that is to say, an argument with the kind of force that Aquinas intends his 5 ways to have, proceed from considerations about purported miracles that have happened in the past? For example, could the contemporary Christian apologist plausibly make of Christ's resurrection a standalone argument for the existence of God, suitable for convincing the philosophically sophisticated but open-minded atheist reader to change his mind. Here I am inclined to be very skeptical. The problem is not that a great deal of metaphysical background work would have to be done in order to make an argument for miracles plausible. That is true, but that's also true of what I think are the best arguments for God's existence. For instance, adequately to defend Aquinas' 5 ways requires, in my view, that one also set out and defend the Aristotelian theory of act and potency, hylomorphism, the reality of final causality, and so forth. So that's not the problem with making of miracles a standalone argument for God's existence. The problem is rather that to make an argument for miracles plausible, a great deal of specifically theological background work has to be done. One has to give, for example, an account of what a miracle is, and to do that properly requires an understanding of the scholastic notions of divine conservation and concurrence, which in turn requires an understanding of the notions of causality operative in arguments like Aquinas' first way and his second way. One has to make it plausible that God would cause a miracle in the first place, which requires an account of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural and of divine providence. One has to make it plausible that, even given all of this background, it is overwhelmingly more likely that the explanation of a purported bizarre historical event is that it was a miracle caused by God, rather than that the witnesses got things wrong, or that the story's been fabricated, or what have you. Now, it seems to me that to do all this background work, which I think can be done in the case of the most important miracles, certainly like the resurrection, will in effect require setting out all the key ingredients for arguments like the first way or the second way or the fifth way in Aquinas' 5 ways, and perhaps even the arguments themselves. That is to say, most of the work required to argue for God's existence will already have been done before one even gets to the miracle claim. In that case, the miracle claim does not add much, if anything, to the argument for God's existence. Of course, it does add a great deal to the argument for Christianity specifically, but that's a different matter. I'm not talking about specifically Christian apologetics. The question is, does an appeal to a miracle constitute a plausible argument, a standalone argument, just for the existence of God, conception of God common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and purely philosophical theism? And that I'm skeptical of. This is no doubt why in some older neo-scholastic works on natural theology, the treatment of miracles comes only after the arguments for God's existence and attributes, and the nature of divine conservation and concurrence, and the notion of divine providence, and so on, have already been laid out. Appeals to miracles are crucial for specifically Christian apologetics. They are the bridge from natural theology to specifically Christian theology, but it seems to me they are not suitable for purposes of general natural theology itself. Okay, so those are my remarks on Father Ramelow's paper. Now, let me turn to Father Dodd's paper, which is titled The God of Life, the Science of Life, and the Problem of Language. Once again, available in God, Reason, and Reality, edited by Father Ramelow. Get those cell phones out and start ordering. Order early and often, to quote Father. Father Dodds discusses, among other things, the various attempts made by modern scientists to provide a definition of life, and the way in which the doctrine of the Trinity illuminates the idea that there is life in God. One suggestion I would like to make is that the scholastic metaphysical distinction between the essence of a thing and a thing's properties helps to illuminate both of these issues. I will also remark upon the question briefly touched on by Father Dodds of how God can be said to have life if, as the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition holds, life involves a kind of self-motion, whereas God is said within that tradition to be immutable or unmoving. How can these be reconciled? First, let me elaborate upon the Aristotelian notion of life as entailing a kind of self-movement. By motion or movement, of course, the Aristotelian does not have in mind change of spatial location or local motion, like an object moving from one point in space to another, at least not exclusively or even primarily. Any actualization of a potential counts as a motion. And in the Aristotelian tradition, this includes not just local motion, but qualitative and quantitative change, and at least in an extended sense of the word motion, changes of substance. Now, it might seem that this definition of life is too broad, for don't certain kinds of machines that we would not want to count as alive move or change themselves? Think of an automatic coffee maker which will turn itself on at a certain time in the morning, or a computer which automatically downloads program updates. To understand what is wrong with this objection, though, it is useful to keep in mind that for Aristotelians, the self-motion characteristic of living things is to be understood in terms of the distinction between what are called imminent causation and transient or transient causation, to which Father Dodds makes reference in his paper. A transient causal process is one that terminates in something other than the agent. I suppose I might put the distinction on the board here. Imminent causation versus transient causation, where it's the first that's going to be distinctive of living things. So, turning to the text here, a transient causal process is one that terminates in something other than the agent, other than the cause. A loose boulder is rolling down a hill and knocking into another boulder, which in turn knocks into a parked car and dents it, would be an example of such a causal process. An imminent causal process is one that terminates within the agent and tends toward the agent's flourishing or perfection. A snake's digesting a mouse that it has just eaten would be an example of such a causal process. The cause is the snake, and the overall effect of the causal process, it doesn't entirely involve what's going on in the snake, but it does partly involve that. It tends toward the snake's own self-perfection. Both living and non-living things exhibit transient causation, but only living things also exhibit imminent causal processes. This is a traditional Aristotelian conception of the key difference between life and non-life, organic and inorganic. Indeed, the irreducibility of imminent causal processes to transient causal processes marks, on the Aristotelian view, the fundamental difference between the organic and the inorganic, and, as I say, is the key to defining life. David Oderberg, to whom I referred earlier, has recently defended this traditional definition of life in some detail, and the irreducibility of imminent to transient causation, both in his book Real Essentialism, which I cited earlier, and in a more recent essay. When we add to this account the Aristotelian distinction between substantial form and accidental form, we can see how machines differ from living things. Coffee makers, computers, and the like have merely accidental rather than substantial forms. That entails that their distinctive teleological features, including any tendency towards self-perfective behavior, are not intrinsic to them, but are imposed from outside by human artificers. In themselves, they are nothing more than aggregates of parts exhibiting purely transient causation, and the imminent causation they appear to exhibit is entirely observer-relative, deriving from the purposes to which the artificers and users of these devices happen to put them. So something with an accidental form, if you're not familiar with the distinction between accidental and substantial form, an example I like to use is the distinction between, say, what's called a liana vine. Who knew? This is the vine that Tarzan likes to swing on in the jungle, right? It's called liana vines, it turns out. Well, a liana vine, as a natural object, has kind of built-in tendency towards certain activities, like sinking roots into the ground, drawing in nutrients, exhibiting certain growth patterns, perhaps growing toward the light or whatever. Those reflect the fact that a liana vine has a substantial form. You could almost say that that's what it is for the vine to have a substantial form. Contrast that with a hammock that Tarzan might make out of a number of living liana vines, where the hammock, to be a hammock, is something to have a shape that's suitable for taking a nap in and so forth. Now, being a hammock is, to be a hammock is to have a merely accidental rather than substantial form, because unlike the functions of taking in water and nutrients, which are built into the vine, the function of serving as a place to take a nap, that is not built into the vines. That is imposed from outside. It's an accidental, in the sense of a non-essential feature of the vines when they're tied together. And if they're living liana vines and Tarzan makes a hammock out of them, he'll no doubt have to prune the vines over time, retie them, because their natural tendency is not to function in a hammock-like way, but to function in a vine-like way. That's what it is for them to have a merely accidental form rather than a substantial form. Well, coffee makers, computers, and the like are relevantly like the hammock. They have merely accidental forms, non-essential, rather than substantial forms. They don't have built-in tendencies the way that natural objects do. Plants, animals, and human beings, by contrast, have substantial forms rather than merely accidental forms. Their characteristic teleological features, including their tendencies toward the self-perfective behavior definitive of imminent causation and thus of life, are intrinsic to them rather than observer-relative or mere appearance. Hence, they are truly alive, whereas machines of the sort in question merely behave as if they were alive. Now, the Aristotelian tradition goes on to propose that there are in the material world three irreducibly different forms of life. First, there is vegetative or plant life, which is characterized by the capacities for nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Second, there is animal life, which, like vegetative life, involves nutrition, growth, and reproduction, but adds to these its own distinctive capacities, namely sensation, appetite, and locomotion. Finally, there is human life, which includes all of the basic capacities of vegetative and animal life, nutrition, growth, reproduction, sensation, appetite, and locomotion, and adds to them the distinctive human capacities for intellectual activity and volitional action. Like every other substance, plants, animals, and human beings each have an essence, and on the standard scholastic view, the essence of a thing is to be distinguished from its properties. Now, a property is that term, and here is another distinction. I guess I've been making reference to a few of them. So we talked about substantial form versus accidental form. Pardon my penmanship here. And now I'm saying a bit about the distinction between essence, the essence of a thing versus the properties of a thing, in the technical sense of the term properties. So a property, as that term is used in scholastic metaphysics, is shorthand for a proper accident of a thing, an accident that flows or follows from its essence. For example, the essence of a human being is to be a rational animal, and a capacity for language is a property of rational animals. That is to say, a capacity for language is not the essence or even part of the essence of rational animals. Rather, it follows upon being a rational animal. Another example that Aquinas uses, for example, is the capacity for a sense of humor. That's not the essence of being a human being, but it does flow or follow from the essence of a human being. Only a rational animal is capable of the conceptual activity required to find things humorous or funny. So risability, or the capacity for humor, is a property. It follows from, it's kind of a byproduct of being a rational animal, even though it's not the essence. It's in that sense a property or a proper accident. Now, it is possible that the exercise of that capacity for language or for sense of humor, might be frustrated in some particular human being, by brain damage, for example. But that wouldn't make him any less a rational animal. It would just mean that one of the properties that would normally flow from his rational animality has been blocked, as a dam blocks the flow of a river. Now, one of the ways the distinction between essence and properties might be applied to the issues raised in Father Dodd's paper concerns the attempts that contemporary scientists have made to define life. As Father Dodds recounts, the variety of proposed definitions is very wide, and there is not only a lack of consensus on any proposed definition, but even skepticism among many that an adequate definition is even possible. Reproduction, the capacity to evolve, enclosure within some kind of membrane, being constituted of elements such as water and carbon, metabolism, and other features or combinations of features have all been proposed as definitive of life. Now, I would suggest that a problem with such definitions, and one reason why agreement about any of them has been so hard to achieve, is that they all overlook the distinction between essence and properties. They focus on features that are indeed closely related to the essence of living things because they flow from the essence, but which are not themselves the essence. In particular, they focus on features that follow from a thing's being capable of immanent causation. That's really the essence on a traditional Aristotelian analysis. Since there are many such features, it can falsely come to seem that any attempt to define the essence of life would have to include an unwieldy and inelegant conjunction of features. Since the manifestation of a feature can sometimes be blocked, it can also falsely come to seem that the feature has nothing to do with the essence of life after all, if you can find examples where it's not present. But if it were realized that these are properties of life in the technical scholastic sense, then both sorts of conclusion would be avoidable. It would be clear how finding a simple and elegant characterization of the essence of life is compatible with there being so many features common to diverse kinds of living thing. And it would also be clear how such features could be so closely related to the essence, even if they are not in every case manifested, because they're not really the essence, but they naturally follow from it. So naturally they're going to be present in a very wide variety of cases. But that they're not present in every single case doesn't mean that they're not closely related to the essence. They're related as properties are to essence on the scholastic analysis. There's also the problem, though, that the properties contemporary scientists focus on are really properties not even of life as such, but rather of life as it exists in material substances. An immaterial or angelic substance whose characteristic activities were purely intellectual would also thereby exhibit immanent or self-perfective causation, and it would accordingly be alive on the Aristotelian analysis, even though it would not be composed of water and carbon, or be enclosed within a membrane, or have a metabolism, or what have you. Even the vegetative functions common to plants, animals, and human beings are not really essential to life as such, but rather only to corporeal or bodily forms of life. Another possible application of the distinction between essence and properties to our subject concerns the attribution of life to God. As Father Dodds emphasizes, if we can attribute life to God, as the Thomist says that we can, then we have to understand such language in an analogical rather than univocal way, since God has neither the corporeal nor even the angelic limitations that other living things have. So, briefly, in Thomism, there's a traditional distinction drawn between univocal use of terms, when we're using terms in exactly the same sense, as when you talk about the baseball bat, one baseball player swung and the baseball bat some other baseball player swung. Or you talk about a baseball bat and a cricket bat. You're using the word bat in the same sense, even though you're talking about different specific kinds of bat. Then there's the equivocal use of language, which is when you describe what the guy playing baseball swings as a bat, and then you describe the animal that flew in Bruce Wayne's window and caused him to decide to become Batman. You call that a bat, right? Glad it wasn't a butterfly that flew in. That would have been interesting. I think we'd have all the movies where Butterfly Man doesn't quite have the same. But that would be an equivocal use of terms. We're using bat in two completely unrelated senses. But in an analogical use of language, here we have something that we might illustrate with the way we use the term good. We talk about the dinner we had last night. You know, the pizza I had last night was very good. It was good pizza. Or the book I was reading was a really good book. Or John is a really good man. We're presumably not using the term good in exactly the same sense in each of the three cases. Maybe if you're Hannibal Lecter, you know, Bob is a good man, just like the pizza. Silence of the Lamb. Okay. But if that's not what you mean, right, you mean he's a morally good man. You're not using the term good in exactly the same sense in which you're using it when you talk about good food or a good book. But the senses are not entirely unrelated either. They're not as different as the sense between a baseball bat and the flying mammal sort of bat. So for Aquinas, when we speak about God, we're using language in an analogical way. It's not metaphorical, it's literal usage, but it's not univocal. It's not to be understood in exactly the same sense in which we apply words to creatures. So that would be true of our attribution of life to God. But it might seem that life cannot be attributed to God even analogically. For in what sense could the self-motion definitive of life exist in God? Father Dodds emphasizes the way in which the procession of divine persons within the Trinity can illuminate the sense in which there is something like self-motion in God, even though God is also said to be immutable or unmoving or unchanging. But this raises the question of whether life is a divine attribute which can be known only via revelation rather than natural reason. For God's Trinitarian nature is knowable only through revelation. So if God's having life is intelligible only in terms of the Trinity, then it would seem that his having life is knowable only via revelation and cannot be part of natural theology. Natural theology being that a body of knowledge about God that we can know through purely philosophical arguments, apart from divine revelation. Yet Aquinas and Thomas following him have regarded life as an attribute of God knowable through natural reason, via purely philosophical arguments. For we can know via such arguments that there is something analogous to intellect and will in God, and intellect and will involve the self-perfective movement that is definitive of life. Now, perhaps the distinction between essence and properties can help us understand what is going on here. To be sure, it cannot be said that there is a real distinction between essence and properties in God, given that God is absolutely simple or non-composite. This is the doctrine of divine simplicity, on which there is in God no distinction to be made between of any sort in God, between actuality, potentiality, between substance and attributes, between essence and existence, between genus and differentia. No distinction to be made in God. So, strictly speaking, we cannot say that there's a real distinction between essence and properties in God. But I would tentatively suggest that we might speak in a loose sense of the philosophical arguments for God's having intellect and will as showing us the properties of the divine life, and of the doctrine of the Trinity as giving us a glimpse into the very essence of the divine life. Since intellect and will are properties of a certain kind of life, the philosophical arguments tell us that life is of the essence of God. But revelation alone can tell us something of what that life consists in, a deeper grasp than natural reason could possibly have of what the essence of divine life is like. Now, there is still the question of how the self-motion or self-perfection definitive of life, whether we think of it in Trinitarian terms or not, could exist in God, given that he is the unmoved mover and the uncaused cause. For God is pure actuality devoid of any potentiality. So how could there be in him anything even analogous to self-movement or self-perfective immanent causation? Wouldn't these entail the actualization of a potential and thus be impossible to attribute to God? Mustn't we think of a purely actual unmovable mover then as lifeless? In fact, this does not follow, any more than it follows from the fact that infinity is not a number, that it is less than the number 1. If life involves the self-perfection actualization of potentials, then something lifeless would be something with unactualized potencies, unactualized potentials, imperfection. But what is always already purely actual and thus infinitely perfect, as God is hardly that. On the contrary, it would be supremely alive, as Father Dodds notes. As pure actuality, God is not passive or in repose, as something lifeless or dead might be said to be, but precisely the opposite, supremely active. When we say that he does not have life in the same sense we do, but in an analogous sense, then, we don't mean that he has less than what we have in having life, but rather that he has something that is more than what we have. So those are some ways in which I would suggest revising and extending what Father Dodds has said, as I talked earlier about how I would revise and extend what Father Ramelow has had to say in their fine and stimulating papers. I will now brace myself for their suggestions about how I might revise or extend what I have had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fazer. It is now my pleasure to introduce Father Anselm Ramelow. Father Anselm is a friar of the Western Dominican Province and associate professor of philosophy at the DSPT. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Munich, and for the last 6 years, Father Anselm has not only taught, but been philosophy department chair at the DSPT. He has published a number of articles in the area of philosophical theology, philosophical anthropology, and aesthetics. He is the author and editor of several excellent books, including Beyond Modernism, George Lindbeck on the Linguistic Turn in Theology, another book, Translation and Commentary on Questions 21 through 24 of Thomas Aquinas' De Veritate, and of course, he is the editor of the volume which is being discussed this morning, God, Reason, and Reality. And did we mention that you can get it at Amazon.com? So please join me in welcoming Father Anselm Ramelow.
Before I begin with my response, the book, which is now available on Amazon.com, I should mention includes not only contributions from Father Michael Dodds and myself, but there are also a number of other ones, which, for example, Robert Spemann, the German philosopher, and also Thomas Joseph White, another Dominican from the East Coast, Lawrence Duan, and Linda Zagzebski, who gave a talk this summer at our conference, and William Wainwright, and many others. So there's more to explore, and you can find the table of contents online and even little biographies and abstracts that as well. I would like to thank Professor Fazer for his perceptive comments on my article on the God of Miracles, as I called it. Some of the questions he raises do not have an easy answer. This is, I believe, not due to flaws in my argumentation, but due to certain tensions in the subject matter itself. And I will address 3 such points of tension that I found indicated in the talk. These are not exactly the 3 ones that Professor Fazer himself outlined. Rather, it will be about the notion of metaphysical necessity and what that means. Secondly, about improvisations and director's cuts, as models for God's plan. And thirdly, what can or should be proved by miracles. So first, the notion of metaphysical necessity. Let me begin with an observation on that comment of Professor Faeser that the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary because they reflect the natures or essences of things. I stumbled over that phrase because I understood this phrase to mean that such laws are absolutely necessary in the sense of Spinoza, who for that very reason rejects the possibility of miracles. For if something is absolutely necessary, then not even God can interfere with it. If one were to formulate this metaphysical necessity in the semantics of possible worlds, which Spinoza would not, one would have to say that such natures and their laws would hold in all possible worlds. Of course, it might be that such natures do not exist in all possible worlds, as Professor Faeser himself suggests. Yet even if we take metaphysically necessary in a minimal sense, meaning only necessary within this one actual world that we are living in, even then the claim would be too strong for our purposes. If miracles, ex hypothesi, do happen in this one actual world, then they cannot be taken to change something that is metaphysically necessary. The temporal revocation of a law that Professor Faeser himself later considers would appear to be a contradiction if the law is metaphysically necessary. But not only miracles would be impossible if we take the laws of nature or of natures to be metaphysically necessary. Even defects might then be impossible. And I think we in many ways agree, but I'm rephrasing or rearticulating this here right now. But this is why I argued that laws of nature describe what normally takes place, but not universally or with absolute certainty. It is part of the nature of things that they are open for variations, and variations that happen in two directions, up and down. First, there are variations down, namely by failure and defect. Horses have eyesight by nature. That is part of the law of their nature. Yet the nature of a horse is not metaphysically necessary in the sense that it would exclude the possibility of blind horses. Then there are variations up. The same natures do have an obediential potency, as the scholastics say, to be elevated by grace or to do things miraculously that they could not do by their natural capacities alone, such as bilocating or levitating. Such up and down openness of natures should not be taken as flatly contradicting nature, but as a certain addition to and subtraction from the nature of things. Such variations are possible only in a metaphysics of act and potency. Defect and privation, variation downward, is in this understanding a lack of actualization, while grace, variation upwards, can be considered an over-actualization. Miracles will typically be a variation upwards, an elevation or over-actualization of natures. Yet Professor Faeser points us to difficult cases that, to the contrary, seem outwardly destructive of nature. Jesus' drowning of a herd of swine comes to mind. Given such examples, it seems harder to reject the notion of miracles as a violation of nature, or at least as a variation downwards. Here, I admit, I have no easy answer, and I don't think anyone has. Professor Faeser suggests the example of the three young men not being burned in the oven by Nebuchadnezzar. Here, fire's nature is destructively prevented from doing its thing. Professor Faeser rightly proposes that here God is not destroying something, but he's just stopping to do something that is not cooperating with the usual actualization of the nature of fire. God is simply leaving something out. In addition, I would suggest that this might actually be something positive, namely a positive power on the side of the three young men, a resistance from their side against the destructive nature of fire. Still, there are harder cases to reckon with. Sometimes God seems to do something directly violent. For example, when Jesus curses the fig tree, and it withers as a consequence. Perhaps this could be understood still in analogy to God's hardening the heart of Pharaoh. Aquinas understands that phrase to mean that God merely refrains from giving Pharaoh the grace of conversion, and the hardening of the heart then is just a consequence of that. And then it would still be a matter of leaving something out, in this case suspending the power of vegetative growth in a fig tree, in that example. Such leaving out is often not even outside the normal course of nature. As C.S. Lewis points out when commenting on that very withering of the fig tree, all plants eventually wither and die. That is itself part of their nature. Many plants necessarily wither periodically as part of their natural life cycles. Here God merely accelerates the process, perhaps by stopping to cooperate with the normal life functions of the tree. Hence, we do not have to conclude that God straightforwardly contradicts himself or violates his own creation. Aquinas also uses the parallel of the ebb and tide of bodies of water on earth. Ebb and tide happen under the influence of the moon, against the nature of gravitational pull of the water. Even though natural gravitation is contradicted by such a movement, Aquinas would not want to characterize this motion as violent. Water is part of a larger system of nature within which such motions are perfectly normal. Still, in cases of chastisements and witherings, such events are, as supernatural occurrences, harder to distinguish from the mere subnatural failure of the potential of a thing. The miraculousness of the effect might then just lie in the rapidity or totality of its occurrence. As the most extreme case, you would consider the total disappearance of a thing, a failure not just of its second act, but of its first act, which also requires God's cooperation, if you want. If the eschatological end of the world would be of that sort, then it would need to be considered a supernatural intervention. Total annihilation would refer to the first cause just as much as the Big Bang. Still, how are we to make sense of destructive miracles? Generally, destruction would be considered subnatural, a variation downward. But on a larger scale, it could be in harmony with the supernatural order that constitutes a variation upward. Accordingly, Professor Faeser suggests that there could still be a positive final cause, a purpose to it. Such final causes, I would suggest, are articulated not by descriptions of natural causalities, but by narratives. Narratives that make intelligible the intentions and actions of rational agents. These intentions and their narratives constitute a larger story in which even something like a chastisement, such as the story of Lot's wife or the death of Ananias and Sapphira in the Book of Acts, can be part of a greater good. Or, as C.S. Lewis suggests for the withered fig tree, it could be part of an enacted parable, which is its own form of narrative. In some cases, the destructive chastisement can also involve more than one agent. Thus, Aquinas suggests that the drowning of the swine is the work of demons, not of Jesus, who merely permits the destruction of the swine in view of the larger good and the larger story. Now, the largest story to be told would be salvation history. And this leads us to the next section, improvisations and director cuts as models for God's plan of salvation history. Considering this largest story, salvation history, Professor Faeser raises the question of how the story could be best articulated. And here the difficulties might be more theological in nature rather than philosophical. Professor Faeser suggests two analogies: an analogy with improvisation, where God, in working miracles, improvises additions to the story. Improvisation exists not only in jazz. Bach himself was a great improvisator, and so was Beethoven and Bruckner, and the long tradition of organists too. Anyway, but that would be the analogy of improvisation.
That was probably sure.
Yeah. Good. So But improvisation would be one analogy. The other one would be the director's cut analogy, where the larger story includes new material, perhaps even subplots and other scenes that dramatically alter the film, just as miracles dramatically alter the natural order of things. Intuitively, I prefer the second analogy perhaps because improvisation seems to be a bit too loose when it comes to divine providence. I myself suggested the idea of a lost chapter that is rediscovered and that finally makes the plot of the novel intelligible. I took this idea from C.S. Lewis' very suggestive book on miracles. C.S. Lewis was an author himself and had a marvelous eye for such features of authorship. Professor Faeser does not particularly like Lewis's idea because it would imply that nature on its own is deficient and unintelligible without the lost chapter of miracles. And indeed, on the largest scale, this analogy seems to imply that creation would have been deficient and unintelligible without the miracle of the incarnation constituting the lost chapter in the story. Now, here we need to walk a very fine line. There is no simple answer, I think. On the one hand, we might side with Aquinas against Duns Scotus and deny an absolute predestination of Christ. That is, we would deny that Christ would have come had Adam not sinned. Thus, without the fall, nature would have been complete and intelligible on its own. There would be no lost chapter. Still, in post-lapsarian terms, that is, after the fall has actually happened, nature has become less intelligible and deficient. It has varied downwards. Thus, if we were to read the story without the chapter of the incarnation now, it would be the story of a fall without redemption. It would be a story with a God who does not care or does not have a backup plan. I'm not sure that the story would be intelligible. The Exalted of the Easter Vigil gives us some clues. It suggests that without the chapter of the Incarnation, our nature would not only be deficient, but our whole existence would be in vain. Nihil enim nobis nasci profuit, nisi ret imi profuisset. In vain would we have been born without the redemption. So yes, the analogy of the lost chapter does imply that in the actual order of things, nature is deficient and unintelligible on its own. Moreover, since God was not surprised by the fall, even in a pre-lapsarian state, this chapter was not outside of God's plan. That is, it was not outside of the author's story. That is why the Exalted can sing of the happy fault that gained for us such a Redeemer. The chapter was always part of the plan, even if, in the logical order, its planning followed the fall of Adam. On the other hand, while nature in this sense is incomplete, this should not lead us to think that nature anticipates the supernatural in its own terms. The story of salvation history is not just part of an unfolding of nature, as Hegelian forms of thought might suggest. Otherwise, the incarnation, grace, and miracles would be something owed to us. It would happen automatically, rather than being a story with choices and actions, with reactions and happy falls that lead to our redemption. In this story, the supernatural variation of nature is not always already anticipated in a supernatural existential, as Karl Rahner might say, or in a desiderium naturale videndi Deum, a natural desire to see God. This would indeed, as Professor Faeser quotes Humani Generis, destroy the gratuity of the supernatural order. So we need to maintain that it is indeed a true variation upwards. And we do not thereby need to imply that our nature, by its variation or elevation, is violated or interfered with. I think it is philosophically reasonable to say that the human mind, being infinitely open to all reality, is capable of various degrees of actualization, from philosophical contemplation to the beatific vision, without the implication of a defect in the absence of the supernatural order. Again, I doubt that one can make sense of this tension apart from the analogy of being and the metaphysics of act and potency. If we are boxed into univocal categories, in the sense that Professor Faeser explained, which is what Scotists might do, then grace can only either destroy nature or make it in a totally different thing, or else add nothing new at all, such that there could be nothing new under the sun. In short, walking the fine line, I think we need to say two things. That nature, so A, that nature has a certain completeness and intelligibility of its own, but also B, that especially given the fall, the lost chapter of the incarnation was always part of the story. It is not a mere arbitrarily added improvisation that might as well not have been there. The incarnation and resurrection remains the key to the whole that allows everything to fall into place. Thus, a Jewish understanding of the biblical narrative will have some intelligibility, but it will lack the key to its deepest level of meaning. If we take Professor Feser's analogy of God as the director of a film, then at the point of the incarnation, God becomes like Alfred Hitchcock, who famously liked to insert an episode in which he himself walked across the scene. And so does God. The one through whom the heavens and the earth were created himself enters his story. This is a truly dizzying thought, and I think such dizziness is an ingredient to any experience of a miracle, which is by its nature mirabile, wondrous. Now, thirdly and lastly, what can or should be proved by miracles? Professor Feser makes some comments about the evidence for miracles and the best use thereof. He would be hesitant to try and make a proof for the very existence of God from the fact of miracles, and I share that hesitation. I would not attempt to do that myself. Yet I do also appreciate daring attempts like that of William Lane Craig, who tries to do just that, proving the existence of God from the evidence for the resurrection. Unless such arguments are so bad that they open Christians up to ridicule, I do appreciate anything that shows the reasonableness of faith. That having been said, I do agree with Professor Feser that it is much more promising to begin with a philosophical proof for the existence of God. Having established the existence of God, the likelihood or prior probability of the occurrence of miracles will be much greater. Given God's existence, the odds will significantly shift in the direction of evidence for a miracle. In addition, if it can be shown that God is good and that he cares, then it is not so unlikely that miracles actually happen. Here it is important to see that presupposing the existence of God is not a presupposition of faith. Beginning with a proof for the existence of God does not mean beginning with faith, because we do not take the existence of God on faith but on reason, beginning with a rational philosophical argument for God. Thus, such an argument does become itself part of the rational evidence that we have for miracles, without begging the question. But not only the existence of God, even the recognition of miracles itself does not presuppose faith. We do not accept miracles on faith. Sometimes one can hear that even among well-meaning Catholics. Rather, we accept our faith based on the evidence of miracles. If you do not believe me, believe at least the works I am doing, says Jesus. And Jesus here implies that works are visible to people that do not yet have faith. As such, the acceptance of miracles has to be based on reasonable evidence and cannot already depend on faith. The existence of miracles cannot be taken on faith precisely because they are to prove the credibility of our faith in the first place. Given such evidence, what then do miracles add to our knowledge of God? It seems that we do already have perfectly fine philosophical knowledge of God and his nature, even before we consider miracles. Are miracles then merely a gratuitous illustration of what we know already? Or do they add something? Professor Feser suggests that the one thing miracles add is evidence for the truth of Christianity. As such, miracles would then allow for a rational transition from philosophy to faith. Now, this is certainly true, but I think that this is not the only thing miracles add to our philosophical knowledge of God. I would claim that miracles can provide empirical evidence for further philosophical insights about God. They do not so much add another proof for the existence of God. Oops, this is a spider that dropped. That would be very bad, a destructive miracle, I guess. That's weird. Very strange spider, too. From above, but downward. So miracles do add something to our knowledge about God, and this in the following way. However, we are going to articulate the variations that miracles perform upon natures. These special acts of God show that He is the master of nature and its laws. Miracles show that natures and their laws are subject to Him who is nature's author. And this, in retrospect, throws light on these very natures themselves, namely that they come from the same source as the miracles themselves, and that the source is not just a first mover, but indeed a person, someone who is omnipotent, possesses foresight and purpose, is benevolent and free. Some of these properties might be deducible in other ways as well, but for the most part, miracles might be our best available evidence for these attributes of God. And I would not rule out that such evidence could be available outside of Christianity as well, such as God listening to the prayers of a pious Muslim woman who is asking for the miraculous healing of her child. Evidence for miracles would then also tell us about God that He is a being worthwhile praying to, and a being to whom we can reasonably express gratitude. This is not trivial. Not all philosophies of God, and not even all religions, are compatible with that evidence. And one does not yet have to be a Christian to come to see the evidence as such. One does not even have to be an atheist yet. While proofs for the existence of God strengthen the evidence for miracles, this evidence is visible even to an atheist scientist. And this is not merely an arbitrary claim from my side, it is precisely the method that the Church employs when she asks atheist doctors to look at the miracles of Lourdes. Such doctors will not necessarily be converted, but they can and will state that there is something naturally inexplicable. So why then is the atheist not converted? Is it because we did not precede the evidence with a proof for the existence of God? I don't think so. For some, the insight might come uno actu, witnessing the miracle and coming to believe in the existence of God. Still, not all do so. Why not? Perhaps the evidence is not strong enough. I'm not sure we can say that either. Otherwise, our belief in and through miracles would not be rational and justifiable. Here again, we have a fine line to walk. Professor Faeser says that, on the one hand, St. Thomas the Apostle could not help being convinced by the encounter with the risen Christ. On the other hand, he seems to suggest that there is not enough evidence for miracles, because they do not happen frequently enough. After all, as miracles, they cannot occur as frequently as the normal workings of nature. I think that this seeming contradiction illustrates yet another tension that is worth keeping. And I suspect that the deeper reason for the tension might be found elsewhere. For I probably would have to disagree with Professor Faeser that miracles merely lack frequency and the necessary regular and repeatable patterns. Some miracles do, after all, happen in predictable patterns, such as the annual liquefaction of the blood of St. Januarius. Certainly, miracles do not have the same frequency as normal occurrences, but that does not make the miracles insufficient in evidence or certainty, as David Hume claimed. In fact, we can test many of them, as we can test any well-confirmed theory. Some of the evidence can be even subjected to repeated testing and indefinitely repeatable testing by the methods of forensic criminology, as has been done with the Shroud of Turin or the Tilma of St. Juan Diego and many Eucharistic miracles. Other confirmation is provided by medical testing, as in the cases of the miracles of Lourdes. So the evidence is not too weak, and here is where then the quotation of the First Vatican Council applies. If anyone says that miracles can never be known with certainty, nor can the divine origin of the Christian religion be proved from them, let him be anathema. So I own that. On the other hand, I do not think that this should make us say that St. Thomas the Apostle was necessarily or automatically convinced by putting his fingers in Jesus' side. The point is that something can be objectively rational and certain, yet it can be subjectively unrecognized. Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman has a sermon for the feast day of St. Thomas the Apostle that addresses precisely this question. After quoting a number of scripture passages where people are praised for their faith, he warns his listeners that, on the one hand, what is praised here is not a form of fideism, not a belief without or even against reason. On the other hand, he suggests that there are indeed necessary dispositions that lead to the subjective acceptance of the rational evidence. And I quote, "Now those passages cannot mean that faith is against reason or that reason does not ordinarily precede faith, for this is a doctrine quite contrary to revelation. But I think I shall not be wrong in understanding them thus, that with good dispositions, faith is easy, and that without good dispositions, faith is not easy, and that those who were praised for their faith were such as had already the good dispositions, and that those who were blamed for their unbelief were such as were wanting in this respect, and would have believed, or believed sooner, had they possessed the necessary dispositions for believing, or a greater share of them." End quote. In other words, there are two extremes to be avoided. One, saying that the evidence is not rationally or quantitatively sufficient, and two, that our belief is unavoidable or automatic. The evidence is enough for a miracle to be visible even to an atheist, but the act of faith still involves an assent that depends on both the cooperation of our will and the cooperation of God, giving us the gift of faith, of course. Now, what is required from us in terms of our cooperation, or as Newman would say, our good dispositions, this can be further illustrated with Blaise Pascal, and I'm almost done. Pascal famously insists that God gives enough evidence to those who seek him, but not enough to those who are indifferent or even defiant. God can only be found by those who seek him. In Pascal's own words, quote, "It was not then right that he should appear in a manner manifestly divine and completely capable of convincing all men, but it was also not right that he should come in so hidden a manner that he could not be known by those who should sincerely seek him. He has willed to make himself quite recognizable by those, and thus willing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart, and to be hidden from those who flee from him with all their heart, he so regulates the knowledge of himself that he has given signs of himself, visible to those who seek him and not to those who seek him not. There is enough light for those who desire to see, and enough obscurity for those who have a contrary disposition." Does that mean that our belief depends on our desire or our will rather than on evidence? Well, this is me now speaking. By no means. The evidence is objectively there. It is not the fault of the evidence if we are blind by our own fault and will. It is the blindness that is willful, not the belief. Cardinal Newman makes the same point by contrasting the two attitudes as active and passive, respectively. And I quote, "The one goes to meet the truth. The other thinks that the truth ought to come to him. The one examines into the proof that God has spoken. The other waits till this is proved to him. He feels no personal interest in it. He thinks it is not his own concern, but, if I may so say so, God Almighty's concern. He does not care to make the most of his knowledge. He does not put things together. He does not add up his facts and accumulate his arguments. He leaves all this to be done for him by him who speaks to him. And if he is to have any trouble in the matter, then he is willing to dismiss it altogether. And next, supposing proof is actually offered him, he feels no sort of gratitude or delicacy towards him who offers it. He says without compunction, 'I do not see this,' and 'that does not follow,' for he is a critic and a judge, not an inquirer, and he negotiates and bargains where he ought to be praying for light." End quote. Newman thought that it was the initial fault of the Apostle Thomas that he wanted to prescribe to our Lord the way in which he was going to believe him. In the Gospel, people are frequently portrayed as asking for signs and wonders, and when they are produced, they are never the right ones. What then is it that leads to the right attitude, the attitude of true seekers? To Newman, it was not a mere act of the will or arbitrary belief. Rather, it was the voice of God speaking in our conscience. Knowledge of the existence of God does not come by preceding proofs, but from an encounter with God, the perception of a voice that speaks with authority. We might not understand correctly what the voice is saying, but precisely for that reason, we are called to become seekers in order to attune our ears to hear the voice ever more clearly. To Newman, it is the voice of conscience that throws us out of ourselves, that indeed makes us seekers in the sense of Pascal. It requires us to look actively beyond ourselves and to find God's communications beyond our own preconceptions. And it is in this way that we will then also encounter the evidence for miracles. Sometimes it can happen all at once, encountering the evidence for a miracle and encountering God. But often it happens in a process of seeking and growth, which begins with recognizing God's voice. This voice speaks already, and most clearly, Newman suggests, in children. Thus, the encounter happens always already at the root of our being, because it is in our own nature that we find God authorizing this very nature. The authoritative voice of the author of nature asks us to trust this, our nature, and its faculties. For without the faculties of our mind, we could indeed neither question, nor prove, nor disprove anything, including the evidence for miracles. And so I do not have simple answers to Professor Faeser's comments and suggestions. I do think that my answers are logically coherent, but they have to straddle certain tensions that are due, I think, to the very complexity of the subject matter. But I will be ready to stand corrected. Thank you.
It is now my privilege to introduce Father Michael Dodds. Father Michael Dodds is a friar of the Western Dominican Province and professor of philosophy and theology at the DSPT. He received his doctorate in sacred theology from the University of Freiburg and is a leading scholar in the dialogue between science and religion. He has done extraordinary work in the area of divine action, and in his teaching and research continues to explore the larger mutual implications of natural science and natural theology. Father Michael Dodds is the author of a number of books, including The Unchanging God of Love, Thomas Aquinas in Contemporary Philosophy, Unlocking Divine Action, Contemporary Science and Thomas Aquinas, and The Seeker's Guide to 7 Life-Changing Virtues. Father Michael Dodds has served as Regent of Studies and Student Master for the Western Dominican Province, as Academic Dean for the Dominican School, and he has served as chair of both philosophy and theology departments, never, I think, simultaneously. Please join me in welcoming Father Michael Dodds.
Thank you. And thank you to Professor Faeser for joining us today for his comments. Thanks to Father Anselm for writing this very excellent book. I'm in the area of theology and science, so I was happy to see that Father Anselm has a very high-tech cover on this book. If you have a smartphone and you aim it at this design, it will take you to the publisher's website in Germany, where you'll find a description of the book. So if you don't find your way to Amazon.com, just take a picture of the cover of the book. Well, before responding to Professor Faeser, I want to just say a word or two about what I wrote for those of you who may not yet have had a chance to get a hold of the book and read the article, or those of you who have read it but not yet perhaps committed it to memory. I first point out that throughout the Bible, God is referred to as the God of life, and there seems to be no theological problem with that. Of course, if we follow Aquinas, the very word God might be problematic, since he teaches that we cannot know what God is, but only what God is not. But if we refuse to be sidetracked by that dilemma, there's another problem with the word life. We can all recognize life when we see it. You recognize whether your goldfish is alive or dead as you walk by the bowl. But we become somewhat tongue-tied when we try to give a definition of life, say exactly what it means. So biologists find themselves in this dilemma. One of them says, I have observed and am resigned to the fact that it is practically impossible to bring physicists, chemists, biologists into an agreement on what life is. The best they can do when asked what life is show some of its characteristics, the material components that make up life, like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and so on. Some note that living things have a sort of membrane that in order to contain these chemicals. I think of the Star Trek episode where humans are described by some aliens as ugly carbon bags of mostly water. They have some sort of container for their chemicals. Besides this, they note the activities that are essential to life, like metabolism, growth, and so on. One biologist sums up the dilemma of the scientists in the title of one of his articles. Edward Macquarie titles his article, Why I Stopped Worrying About the Definition of Life and Why You Should as Well. Well, philosophers do define life. Thomas Aquinas defines it broadly, as Professor Fazer has pointed out, as self-motion. Aquinas says, we say that an animal begins to live when it begins to move itself, and as long as such movement appears in it, so long as is it considered to be alive. Well, if these definitions, attributes, apply to life that we find in creatures, which of them do we keep when we talk about divine life? God isn't made up of carbon and hydrogen. There's no membrane to contain such chemicals. Nor do we attribute nourishment, growth, reproduction, evolution to God. So the question arises, does life, God's life, have anything in common with the life of creatures? And the simple answer is no. God utterly transcends the kind of life we find in creatures. Does that mean that we can say nothing about divine life? Again, the answer is no. There is much that we can say, much that we can talk about with respect to divine life, as long as we remember that God is not like creatures. Creatures are certainly in some way like God, since God created them, and in effect is in some way like its cause. To talk about God's life, perhaps we can go back to Aquinas' idea of self-motion that characterizes living creatures. Though God does not grow or move from place to place, God does know and love. And these are also kinds of motion. Thinking of divine life in this way brings us to the very center of the mystery of God, the life of the Trinity of divine persons, of Father, Son, and Spirit. Aquinas and St. Augustine use the motions of knowing and loving to describe the dynamic processions within the intimate life of God. Well, I turn to Professor Fazer's remarks. He takes up the question of how God can be said to have life if in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition life is said to involve self-motion, and looks at these notions, as I have, of immanent motion and transient motion. Professor Fazer uses the term causation. Now, I don't know if this is quibbling over vocabulary, but I wonder if we want to talk about motion. I'd be happy to see that I have equally four handwriting. Motion. transient motion involves things like sawing a block of wood or heating up water. The motion, in some sense, passes from a doer to a receiver, from the fire to the water. And there's always a kind of potentiality involved in this sort of motion. The water has to be potentially hot before actually hot. Immanent motion is of a different kind. Examples are knowing and loving. Immanent because the act of knowing and loving remains in the doer and does not necessarily involve any potentiality. Certainly within divine life, immanent motion and love, immanent knowing and loving, which is God's, doesn't involve actualization of a potency, but even our knowing. You could sit here for the next 15 minutes if you like and remember or know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. You'll be knowing something, you'll be doing something, but you'll be involved in simply an activity, not the actualization of a potency. So, these kinds of distinctions allow us to talk about a motion within God that is true and that we can then say is a sign or a way of talking about divine life. Professor Faeser also offers the distinction between the essence of a thing and its properties. I'm not quite sure where he's going when he applies this distinction between essence and properties to the life of God. He says, I would tentatively suggest that we might speak in a loose sense of the philosophical arguments for God's having intellect and will as showing us properties of the divine life, and the doctrine of the Trinity as giving us a glimpse into the very essence of the divine life. So a distinction between the properties and essence using philosophy and theology. But I wonder, given divine simplicity, even philosophically speaking, God's knowing and loving are certainly one with the divine essence, since all that is in God is God. So I wonder about saying that philosophy can get us only as far as the properties of divine life, and we have to wait for theology, the doctrine of the Trinity, to get us to the essence of divine life. And even after we've gotten to theology, Aquinas would still say we don't know what God is. The depth of divine life remains mystery. The distinction between essence and properties that flow from essence is also helpful, though, I think, for scientists who are struggling to define life by enumerating the properties of living things. Professor Faeser suggests that we should consider the essence of the living thing from which the properties flow, rather than simply concentrate on the properties themselves if we're trying to give a definition of life. I think that this distinction between essence and properties can be very helpful in that discussion. But the challenge for us Thomists would be to communicate to the scientific community exactly what we mean by essence as a feature of organisms distinct from their properties. Empirical science can study properties, observe how an organism eats, grows, reproduces, and so on, since all of these are measurable and experimentally observable. But empirical science cannot observe essence or substantial form. So how do we Thomists let the scientific community know what we're talking about when we use these terms? Or more fundamentally, how do we convince them that we're really talking about anything at all when we're talking about a principle that is not as such measurable? How do we indicate that we're really talking about an aspect of the natural world, but an aspect that escapes the methodology of empirical science? Well, perhaps Professor Faeser can help us out with that during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. We now have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions and answers. We will be asking you to state your question clearly into a roving microphone. So go ahead and raise your hand and then allow just a moment for someone to come to you with a microphone. I'd also ask that you specify who you are directing the question to, whether you're directing it to all three of our speakers or a particular speaker. Without further ado, please offer your questions. Yes.
Father Anselm, you quote the Pascal on this whole thing about God provides enough light for those who see and enough darkness for those who flee. And I've always found that sort of an irritating ad hominem against skeptics. Mm-hmm. He seems to be saying, if you only had pure intentions, you'd see and admit that I'm right. And I'm wondering if there's a place in your discussion here for honest unbelief.
Yeah, I think with Pascal, and that's true, I think also for the wager argument and things like that, one has to be sure that this is actually preceded by a lot of other things that give the evidence in the first place. It is sort of really to push you over the last hump, after the argument has been already made. So it's not just starting out of the blue and voluntaristically saying you believe or otherwise you're a bad person or something like that. That's the first thing. And I think indeed Pascal in particular is very much an either-or person, perhaps in the sense of Kierkegaard is a similar tradition. Which doesn't leave much of a middle ground, like honest disbelief or skepticism. And Newman is certainly coming on strong too in many ways, but I think he has more room for degrees. There is a way in which you can grow, and where he would say, well, maybe you should listen more to that voice or become more a seeker in the first place, and then there could be degrees, So he would perhaps have a bit more leeway for, let's say, accommodating an honest skeptic, How about me? I would follow Newman rather than Pascal in that, yeah. But I do think that Newman has some interesting insights, which I only hinted at the end. Probably shouldn't. Yeah, but I think there's a lot to discover in Newman in that regard, in the Grammar of Assent and other books.
I think in front here.
Yes, my question is directed to Dr. Fazer. Earlier in your lecture, you draw a contrast between the laws in the Humist model and the laws in the Aristotelian Thomist model, where in the latter, laws are manifestations basically of formal causality, but you don't describe where laws originate in the Humist model. What do Hume and his successors give in that regard? Could laws be thought of as something of a brute fact in such a metaphysical model?
Well, yeah, I would say that on Hume's model, laws essentially are brute facts. Ultimately, I mean, you might have a way of reducing higher level laws to lower level laws. So you could be a Humean and take the position, say, that the laws of chemistry are reducible to those of physics and so forth, and then different layers of laws within physics are reducible to deeper levels of laws of physics. But I think you're going to have to end up saying, on a Humean position, that the most fundamental laws of nature are simply the way they are, and that's all that can be said. They're brute facts, as it were. And the way a Humean position is often cashed out, sometimes it's cashed out in terms of what's called a regularity theory. So to say that it's a law of nature that A generates B, say, is just to say that A tends to be followed by B, the sort of scheme I put up on the board there. And that's all you can say about it. So that if you take every other law of nature down to some primitive set of laws, that the bottom level is going to involve nothing more than a kind of brute fact that the regularity operates, in which case the fundamental laws of nature don't really explain anything. They merely describe. They're merely descriptions of what happens to be the case. There's nothing more to be said. Now, you could take Hume's position in another direction in terms of what's called a counterfactual analysis, and modern metaphysicians like David Lewis do this, that we are not merely describing regularities. We're not merely describing what does happen, but what would have happened had other circumstances obtained. That adds some detail to a Hume style account of laws. But when you ask, well, what makes it true, to use the jargon of contemporary analytic metaphysics, what's the truth maker of these counterfactual statements? That had A occurred, B, it's not just that when A occurs, B occurs, but that had A not occurred, B would not have occurred, or had A occurred, then B would have occurred. What makes such a counterfactual analysis of laws true? Again, you could say, well, if we're dealing at the level of higher levels of nature, if we're dealing in biology or chemistry or physics, we can take everything down to some deepest level of laws of physics, but the deepest levels are going to be laws understood in terms of some counterfactual analysis. And then if we ask, well, what makes that deepest level true? You're ultimately, again, going to have to just make of it a brute fact. You're either going to say it's merely a brute fact that the counterfactual holds, or that you can analyze the counterfactuals in some other metaphysical terms. Lewis tries to do it in terms of his theory of possible worlds. But that just kind of kicks the problem back a stage. So what makes it the case that these possible worlds all exist? He thinks they all somehow are as actual as the actual world. That's going to be your brute fact. But at the end of the day, however you spell out the details of a Humean analysis, I think you're going to end up with what is essentially the view that that at the fundamental level of reality, we have brute facts, meaning that's the way the world is, and there's no more to be said. There's no way to make it intelligible. Unlike, say, theism, sometimes it's thought, well, doesn't theism postulate an ultimate brute fact God? But God's not taken to be by a Thomist or a Neoplatonist or any classical theist to be a brute fact, because God exists by his nature, so there is an inner intelligibility. And that's what the human ultimately has to deny of whatever the fundamental level of reality is. And so has to deny that of the fundamental laws. They're just the way they are, and there's no sense to be made of it. Not just that we don't know how to make them intelligible, but they're simply unintelligible in themselves. I think ultimately on a Humean view that you're going to have to say that. And that coheres, if this is coherence, with the rest of Hume's philosophy. I mean, that's what you'd expect, really, a Humean would have to say.
And I think there is reason to argue that brute facts as a concept are altogether incoherent, which may be a weakness on Hume's metaphysics.
Yeah, a small problem with with Hume's metaphysics. I agree.
Yeah, it's in the back.
I have a question for Father Anselm. So, Father, leaving aside the question of whether things, particular miracles like the liquefaction of St. January's blood or the tomb of Juan Diego are in fact as incontestable as you suggest, taking things that, just say, we'll assume are completely incontestable, what would you give as the criteria for distinguishing preternatural from supernaturally caused miracles? Because as you know, I mean, the epistemology of that is kind of got a long and interesting history. I mean, Catholics themselves, like Herbert Thurston of the Society of Jesus, or Celestin Biddle, who I think was a Capuchin, were willing to include things that had formerly been thought in a quasi-official way to be supernatural, either by divine or diabolical, in the range of the preternatural. So what would you give as kind of, rough and ready but clear criteria for distinguishing?
I'm actually not sure I heard the question entirely acoustically, but I think that there are always more distinctions to be made, for one. For one, there would be, as you mentioned, I mean, you included, let's say, finite spiritual beings like angels or demons in the supernatural. I'm not sure what use that term for that, but there would be certainly another distinction to be made between such workings and those of God. The preternatural, I understand to be the gifts that were given to Adam and Eve before the fall, and I'm not sure that is a relevant aspect for what we have been talking about, except where it really becomes a more theological problem. If there are preternatural gifts, in which sense do they anticipate the supernatural order? Even in a prelapsarian mode, that could be indeed a question. I would simply pass that question on to the theologians. But they are preternatural in the sense that they are indeed variations upwards, that they are similar to what I call the supernatural in that sense. So we don't have immortality or impassibility of the sort that Adam and Eve had by nature. That is indeed a variation upwards. But I sense that there's something behind your question that I'm not quite getting at, but...
Sure, I'll give you a concrete example. Both Herbert Thurston, who is a Catholic researcher of miracles, and Celestin Biddle both included things that, like telepathy and what we would now call parapsychological phenomena. They said these are some kind of, and they extended the category of preternatural. They presupposed some sort of post-lapsarian survival of something, but then they said that this kind of thing could account for phenomena that had hitherto been ascribed to either God or angels of a good or bad sort, which introduces kind of an epistemological kind of murkiness that had not been there before.
So then preternatural in that sense would not be necessarily the theological sense of Adam and Eve, but more things, other, even in natural order, things like telepathy. Now, Avicenna would think yes. Avicenna would think that by enough practice and gifts, you could make your mind as strong as to move things at a distance or something of that sort, which Thomas Aquinas explicitly denies. He doesn't think that there is such a thing. And so there is in that field, there's certainly a gray area with a lot of things that even, theologically, the Church doesn't have a very explicit opinion on much of that, I think. And I would not dare to wade in those waters right now.
I think we had a question all the way in the back.
Yes, my comment or questions may be addressed to all three of the speakers, which I very much enjoyed. Thank you, gentlemen. I thought it was interesting that Bach, according to Dr. Ramelow, made the improvisations and, or as my understanding is, inventions. Are you suggesting that he wrote improvisations? Question to you, Dr. Ramelow.
That would perhaps a bit be a contradiction if you write down an improvisation.
Thank you very much.
That has happened too. No, I didn't mean the invenciones that he wrote. That's an actual piece of written music. No, he could improvise. You could sit down. I think, isn't that what he did at the court of Frederick the Great when he was improvising on the art of the fugue? That's how it began. Then he wrote it down too, But
yes.
But still, he could do that, and it was part of a skill that people took some pride in. And there's a long tradition also of German and French organists being able to do that extemporaneously for hours. Really,
Yes, no, and I agree with you.
I actually don't even see where the question comes from. all the way in the back. That's why.
So I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
And the idea that an author could be both an improviser and an inventor could be addressed to Father Dodd, who talks about scientists don't they both invent and improvise? I think Jaroslav Pelikan in Bach Among the Theologians said it best: either you are a person who enjoys the Passion according to St. John, or you like the Passion according to St. Matthew. Are there any music critics in the audience? I'll let it go. Thank you.
In the third row.
Thank you to all the panelists. I think my question probably relates to Dr. Fazer and Father Dodds. It's sort of a theology and science question, and I guess it's the issue that's come to be known as the problem of the causal joint, and that is, do we need a good theory of how a non-physical agent or a spiritual substance can actually cause changes in a material object? So as theist, I just wonder, what the Thomist line would be on this. Is there some form of efficient causality, but how a a personal agent such as God without a physical body actually causes actions upon material bodies. So I guess the question is, do we need to have a metaphysical theory in order to defend miracles? Because if a disembodied agent cannot act in the physical world, then miracles are impossible. So in terms of burden of proof, or sort of a broad, but it's the question of the causal joint.
I would pass that question to Father Michael Dodds.
That's fine, as long as you volunteer for all the music questions that come up. Yeah, the causal joint was a kind of thing that those involved in the theology-science dialogue on divine action were looking for. You have the transcendent divine cause, you have the world down here. Where do they meet? What's the joint? What's the meeting point? And I think it's a dilemma that arises only if you think about God as being the same kind of cause as all of these other natural causes. They, in some sense, have to encounter each other. One billiard ball has to touch the other one in order for it to move. What makes a being a cause? Well, if you look at it metaphysically, a thing can act only to the extent that it is actual or in act. So God is pure actuality. God is supereminently able to cause, but his causing will not be of the same type as natural causes. In his commentary on the Book of Causes, Aquinas explains that other causes need a kind of relationship. There has to be something between them, a medium in which they meet to act. But the divine cause pervades the world in such a way that there is no intermediary between God's action and the creature. So God is supereminently able to act in virtue of being actuality itself, but acts in a way that is different from that of the creature. Acts through every creature in every event, as Professor Faeser was saying. I couldn't be here talking if God wasn't actualizing me in this moment in some way, but can actualize creatures beyond what they can do naturally, and this would be the miracle. But there would the mode of divine action would certainly escape us if we attempt to explain it the way we explain the mode of causality of other things. Then I think we come up with this insolvable problem of where the two causalities meet, the causal joint.
Just to add a couple of thoughts to that, to Father Dodd's remarks, with which I completely agree. I think part of the answer to that sort of question is also to point out that it's something that we should not expect to understand with the kind of penetration with which we understand causation in the material world. In fact, that we should expect not to be able to understand it, precisely because we move from the order of natural causes to the uncaused cause. We have to understand the nature of that uncaused cause by removing what elements that we apply to conceptualizing natural causes, precisely because they involve potency or potentiality, they involve materiality. We have to deny all that of God. And so we have to deny of God the reasons that lead us to affirm the existence of the uncaused cause at the same time lead us to deny of that uncaused cause, the mode of causality that is exhibited by things like stones and water and trees and living things. We have to corporeal living things. So this is part of what Aquinas is getting at when he talks about the way in which we know what God is not, but not what he is. We know that there must be an uncaused cause. We know we have to affirm of him all sorts of things like omnipotence and omniscience and so forth. But we also know that the very nature of being an uncaused cause, by virtue of being pure actuality devoid of potentiality, God cannot have. He cannot operate the way that a material cause does, for example, so that it would be a mistake to try to model God's causality on the causality of material things. But where this is not an arbitrary appeal to mystery, this is something that follows from the very logic of the arguments. That's one point that needs to be emphasized. And that we see this elsewhere in creation. I mean, our knowledge of ourselves and the nature of the intellect is largely it's largely negative knowledge. The arguments that show that the human mind, for example, is immaterial, tell us what the mind is not. It's not material. The intellect is not material. But that's a negative conception. That's not a positive conception. But the arguments tell us that there must be something that's like that. It's not material. There must be something that we can characterize only in largely negative terms. So we have independent grounds for thinking already, just from philosophical anthropology, that there must be a mode of causality that doesn't involve the kind of causality that corporeal or bodily agents exhibit. That's one point that has to be emphasized, that we have independent reasons for thinking that we ought not to expect to be able to understand divine causality the way we understand the causality of other things. And then there's the additional point, just to finish up with, that the idea that divine causality would have to involve the sorts of things that characterize causality in the world of bodily things. For example, some kind of contact between two objects, say, one billiard ball knocking into another, the sort of classical Hume model of causation. That sort of conception of causality really involves a fallacy of accident. It involves attributing what's really only a contingent feature of causality to causality as such. Causality as such just involves, on the Aristotelian analysis, the actualization of a potency. And there's nothing in that that entails features like bodily contact or transference of energy in the sense in which energy is understood in physics. None of those are essential to the notion of actualization of potentiality, and that's what's essential to causality. Those other things are merely accidental or non-essential features. So we shouldn't expect that they would apply to God's causal relation to the world.
We have time for one more question. Yes, 2/3 of the way back. Thanks.
This question is about scientists. It's for Professor Feiser. About scientists and what they cannot reproduce in their laboratory. My question is, where are scientists in relation to things that they can't reproduce? Do they deny its existence, or do they have some other view about things they can't reproduce?
Well, I guess it really depends on the scientist. So science itself and its methods, I would say, are not really going to tell you whether the sorts of things that are not susceptible of study via its methods are real or not. In fact, the methods rule out, the scientific method, you might say, rules out knowledge via the scientific method of anything that doesn't fit the method. When you get skeptics who argue that if you cannot confirm the existence of a thing via the methods of biology or physics or chemistry or what have you, therefore it's not real, it's not really science that's telling them that, it's scientism, the additional thesis that not only does science give us knowledge, but only science gives us knowledge. But that claim itself is not something that can be argued for scientifically. It's a metaphysical thesis, it's a philosophical thesis. So if the question is, does science itself tell us that what does not fall into its methodological net is not real, I would say no, it doesn't tell us that at all. Do individual scientists say that? Some do, some would not. But when they do, they're wearing a philosopher's hat. They're not wearing a scientist's hat, albeit some of them don't realize that. They might think they're wearing their scientist's hat, but they're not. And this gives me the occasion to respond to Father Dodd's question toward the end of his talk. You asked, Father, how a Thomist might go about arguing with a natural scientist that when we talk about essence versus properties, we're capturing some real distinction. And I think that's an excellent question, and I think there's really no shortcut to that, to answering that question. I think it's one that cannot be answered within, say, just the realm of biology itself. It requires arguing for the incompleteness of natural science in general, the need to move beyond natural science to metaphysics and philosophy of nature in general, and then coming back around to the specific question of how we understand life and biology. But it probably cannot be isolated to just biology. In other words, if you're discussing with a biologist about the nature of life and you appeal to the essence properties distinction, if he's really a hard-nosed, scientistically oriented scientist, probably nothing's going to convince him short of a general argument to the effect that natural science in general is an incomplete account of nature. We need philosophy of nature, we need metaphysics, and if you can convince him of that, you can come back down to biology specifically and argue for the need for the essence property distinction. So that would be my short answer to that. And then Father Ramelow gave excellent examples of these repeatable miracles like the liquefaction of the blood and Lourdes and so forth. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I guess the short response would be that I would want to clarify that when I talk about miracles not being as common as rain or common as air, I didn't mean to deny that there aren't certain classes of miracles that repeat, but they're still not common in one sense, that they're still localized to a certain part of the world, say. What we don't have is something like, the way that gravitation operates absolutely everywhere, or the way that oxygen is breathable absolutely everywhere. We don't find that kind of commonness of miracles across time and space. And if we had that kind of commonality, I think there would be a problem. But I think what I'm saying is consistent with the kind of repeatability you're talking about.
Please join me in thanking all our speakers for a wonderful discussion.